simply as it is. Robert Morris teaches this message called the pure language, because it is a pure language. Because here's the thing, we have such incredible misunderstanding in our communication. Would you agree? Yeah. How many times do we have horrible communication, and even verbally trying to communicate a message back and forth to each other? Sometimes we'll erupt into an argument or whatever, and it's just simply because the person we're communicating with is not really hearing our heart and what we really intend, because we're not really maybe or able to articulate what we really mean, and they're not hearing what we're even meaning. And then you add in the whole issue of Facebook, texting, and email, and it becomes a disaster because nobody has the inflection or everything that goes with that conversation, and they really don't know how you're speaking about things, and there's such miscommunication. Do you know there's a pure language that God has created to be able to speak to Him? The whole thing is, I put down this question there. What is it about? Speaking in tongues. What is the purpose? What is it all about? It is about this very simply. Praying and worshiping the Lord. You personally. That's the main point. It is not about being a spectacle for anybody to hear and hear you like, oh, they speak in tongues. It's not about that at all. And one thing we have to point out and always declare, and this is where all the confusion comes in. This is why people wrestle with the whole issue of, well, Paul said don't do this. No, he didn't. Paul gave clarification in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14. He gave very clear clarification of how the gifts of the Spirit would function in the church setting. There are two distinctions about this whole issue of tongues. Tongues is a natural part of your personal worship and prayer life when you openly just say, Holy Spirit, fill me up with everything you've got for me to walk it out and live in it in every day. And then there's a gift of tongues that it talks about in Corinthians in the operation in the church. That's where and you maybe have been in a service before, where you heard an exhortation in tongues that came with an interpretation with it. And Paul talks about that's the way it needs to be in the church setting. That if there's an exhortation that is loud and proclaimed like it's a word spoken to everybody, it's got to have an interpretation with it. Otherwise, he said, keep it to yourself, because it's your worship and your praise and your prayer to the Lord. Now, let me give you the reality of that, how that works. He says in Corinthians not to forbid speaking in tongues. It actually says that. Well, let's just go ahead and let's jump into that and read that in 1 Corinthians 14. Turn there with me if you would. In that message that Robert Morris is preaching, he's got those points. I put you in there what his points actually are. If you listen to that, you'll see these points. That he talks about speaking in tongues is a language. You know that? Many times it's an actual language. You say, oh, that's never been proven. Yes, it has. I actually looked up online some things that just disturbed me. People say, oh, it's never been proven. Speaking in tongues is not really a language. I know it is. I've seen proof. I've heard proof from people I'm very familiar with. I'll give you three quick stories. There was a service one time, Chuck Smith told this. Chuck Smith, who is the founder of the Calvary Chapel movement out of California. These first two actually happened in his church. The first one, he said there was a lady in their church that actually would sit many times in the back of their large church. She'd come in and she'd be an intercessor. She would pray during the service, just praying that God would move on people's hearts and change lives. And she'd sit clear in the back by herself, and she'd just pray very quietly in the Spirit during the service. Nobody around her, nobody paying any attention, except during this one service when she was praying, there was a couple of ladies up in front of her a little ways. And she was just praying in the Spirit. And after the service, they came back there. And the one lady said to her, she said, thank you so much for what you did. And the lady's like, I'm not sure. I was just praying. She said, what do you mean? She said, well, my friend was visiting, and I think it was from France. I think she was from France. And she said, I know the language, but I can't really interpret. And she said, you just interpreted the whole message for her, everything that was said. And this lady's like, I just thought I was praying. She was literally speaking that language. She did not know it. Another story that Chuck told was in a service when they had a whole group of people. They had been preparing for a missions trip. They were going to send them to this other country, and they were going to do this specific work. And they had even did language classes for them to learn the language of what they were going to learn with, so they could communicate well. On a night before their team was going to go out, they had had a service, and they were praying over this group of people. And one of the people, just laying hands and praying for them, began to just pray in the Spirit quietly. But one of the people heard him and said, I don't know if you realize what you just did. And he's like, well, I was just praying. And they said, you just prayed in the language that we learned from that country, and you prayed exactly and specifically about what we had trained to go do. And the guy's like, okay. That's hard to imagine. I can't imagine actually experiencing something like that, but it does happen.